So working with a vast array of materials, including clay, rare minerals, as well as living materials and processes such as molds, mushroom, bacteria, and fermentation, and even human hormones, Candice has produced a remarkable body of work that consistently interrogates the complex histories of precious materials and commodities, including tea, lithium, and in this case, manganese. Bringing into relief their implications in producing social and political relations while drawing attention to the blurry line between the living body and where it begins to be shaped and transformed by other than human materials, chemical, mineral, or other living organisms. Her works often take the form of large, complex installations that deal with forgotten or erased histories. And in Candice's work, the devil is really in the detail. So every component, including the glazes and pigments that she uses, build into the rich narrative structure of her work. Her work also tackles human and animal relations, and that's something we're going to dive into as well later on, and also often evokes the kind of monstrous and fantastical to broach difficult and painful topics. So I'd love to start. We can pull up a picture of the work here. This is during install. Secretly taken by Lucas. So if you could please tell us a little bit about the work, its kind of genesis. Let's pass the mic, maybe that could be easier. Sorry, it's very interview style, but this is just for filming properly.
So I'll say a little bit, but I don't want to ruin the experience of the work, which is just upstairs. Nightstone started at Sydney Biennale and was co-commissioned with Sydney and MAMA in Melbourne. And I got interested in the history of trade between Australia and Asia in the 1600s, where Indonesian Makassar traders were trading many things, among them sea cucumbers, which were taken as aphrodisiacs by Chinese consumers. And a lot of my work looks at specific materials like porcelain or sugar or cochineal. I recently have shifted to look at materials that are used in art production that are also used in mining or industry. So I finished a show last year on lithium, and this work is looking at manganese. So the title Nightstone actually is my way of referring to this dark mineral, manganese. And in the work upstairs, you'll see a kind of hypnotic, hopefully, water wheel that is telling the story, a speculative story about sea cucumbers ingesting manganese that flows into the ocean from a capsized ship. Yeah, should I stop there? I don't want to.
Maybe about the form as well.
So yeah, the form of it has a couple of references. One of them is Chinese miners in Australia. There was a lot of archives I looked at where they would set up these kind of rough construction wooden structures with a sluice box on top that I don't know if it was black, but in my mind, because I was looking at engravings or like drawings of them, they look like a kind of like moat or box that has a grate in it. So the moat, the black waterway in the sculpture is actually painted with manganese pigment and epoxy, and it's meant to reference the mining sluice boxes, as well as there's a Chinese literati tradition of the wine canal where you take a drink and then you pass it along and it floats down the river and then the next person can take it. They also make like sushi restaurants like that nowadays. Yeah. Oh, should I talk about the sculptures in this version? Yeah. Okay. Do we have an image? Yeah. So that guy has a head. That's missing in the photo, but this version of the installation is different from Sydney and Melbourne in that I created two new sculptures, which are these hybrid animal-human forms. And they kind of reference different mythological creatures that guarded gold or treasures, so like griffins or cyclops, or this kind of female face with a kind of cat-like body. And they're spouting water into the winding canal, and are also a reference to, I went and saw the elephant clock in the Dubai Ibn Battuta Mall, which is amazing. And I was really struck by a lot of, we also went to the Islamic Museum of Civilization in Sharjah, and I was struck by a lot of the water devices for measuring time, and also the use of water for measuring gold, in relation to the gold trade here. Wink, wink. That's for Lucas. So I was thinking about these creatures in relationship to water, and this relation here with different Islamic science, the kind of birth of science and inventions using water as a clock or measuring device. And the murals also are a new part of the installation for here. And they're painted with black paint that has manganese as well. And they depict a mining pit and landscapes off of the coast of Australia on Groote Island, where a lot of manganese is mined.
Thank you. So I wanted to kind of go back in time to 2016 and to your exhibition at Gasworks, A Body Reduced to Brilliant Color. And this was the first time I had encountered your work, and it was kind of your first show as well in Europe, I think. And I just remember it so vividly because it was so different to many things I've seen before. This way that you kind of were transforming materials in this space through this process of kind of distillation and dyeing of tea, and the way that then became kind of part of the, moved into another space within Gasworks and kind of started spreading onto the floor. If we could move back a little bit, sorry. So the work dealt with the kind of histories of trade, of sugar, of tea, and of cochineal, the kind of red pigment. And the exhibition included this kind of system you see here for distillation and dyeing, you kind of fermented the tea, and then it went through this machine and through these porcelain sculptures you had made, and then the dye was kind of projected onto this marble floor, and it just was such a beautiful way of also evoking these bodies that were involved in these processes and trade, but bodies that we sort of never saw or couldn't know. And I think a lot of your work also tries to evoke these, unarchived kind of bodies in history. In the exhibition, there were also these kind of cases with sculptures made out of sugar vases and other things with Madagascan cockroaches living on them. Yeah, it was such an amazing exhibition because it brought together so many materials and was so kind of like tactile in such a beautiful way. But can you tell us a little bit more about it and how, for you, how it was a kind of shift in your practice as well?
Yeah, I think so. Before that, I think I had been mainly making drawings about a lot of kind of looking at early ethnographic watercolors by European explorers, looking at, the current United States, and the way that they depicted that moment of contact in the European imagination. And a lot of that work, I would read a lot about like the kind of colonial products or like plants or goods like cochineal and sugar and indigo that was being grown on plantations and with slavery. And so a lot of that history was in the early work, but in the form of representative images and like illustrating kind of the history or the facts I was interested in. And then this work was kind of this first moment where I decided to let the processes of the materials themselves speak to that rather than showing a representational image of it. And for a long time, actually, with this work, I was confused because I thought that I should do something with the fermented red liquid that it produced, which I should also say had a really strong smell. It which was a big part of it. So you came in, and I think all the British people were disappointed because they're like, oh, what are you distilling? Do we get to drink it? But then I was like, no, sorry, it's just making a big bloody stain in the other room. But for a while, I think I thought I should make a drawing or something out of the stain, but then it just made sense in terms of that colonial history just to have it be this like slowly accumulating stain that got darker and redder over time. Yeah, that's kind of at the end of the exhibition. It's quite a bit darker.
One, two. Okay. Then the next show, the next artwork we want to talk about is very special for me. It's titled A Hard White Body and traveled to 3 institutions, Béton Salon in Paris, Porticus in Frankfurt, and the Logan Center for the Arts in Chicago. And I have to say, it was the first proper exhibition I curated back in 2017. I was a baby curator. I had no idea what I was doing. And you were immensely generous back then. So thank you, Candice. And it was actually possibly still one of the craziest projects that kind of I've ever worked on. The main work that you see on the left consisted in this, I think 900 kilos of sculpture of unfired porcelain that was maintained wet throughout. Sorry?
Limoges porcelain.
That was maintained wet throughout the entire course of the exhibition for over 3 months and slowly kind of decaying and rotting and leading to an interesting kind of life. This was at the beginning and this was near the end. And I mean, we could talk about this project for a very long time, but I really wanted to hear you speak about your relationship in this project to porcelain, because you, as you mentioned already with cochineal and tea, your practice really investigates a lot of materials, products, commodities, which in many cases have are linked to colonial histories, and a lot of these also have a link to the medium that you use, and I think ceramic comes quite often in your practice. Can you tell us a bit more about the way you address this?
Yeah, this was actually the work that got me into ceramics, and then I got addicted to it, and I couldn't stop doing it, and now I teach it, and it's like all that I think about. But I got interested in porcelain actually more for the history, and I hadn't worked with the medium, and I had no idea that working with high fire cone 10 porcelain is the hardest way to start working in ceramics because it cracks really easily. But I got interested in it because of the way it was traded and also the very racialized language around why it was valued for, they would say, things that equated clay bodies are often talked about as bodies, and so they would say porcelain, like Europeans for 200 some years wanted to imitate it but couldn't from Asian countries. And they would talk about it being valuable because it was pure white, superior and hard and impregnable to being stained by brown liquids like coffee or tea. So it was like a commodity that was traded but then like somehow unstainable from the brown commodities of trade. And so I found that really interesting. In relationship to the work that's upstairs, there's a shift, I guess, in that, like for this work, I should say also that it's watered by piss or by urine, that visitors are welcomed to give. And it's this kind of act of taking a material that's usually seen as like a waste product or disgusting or the refuse of society that we don't want to encounter, and used as a liquid that's caretaking and keeping the sculpture from falling apart, albeit like futilely. And then in this case, so like a lot of my interest in ceramics is about how it relates to the body. In the case upstairs, the manganese that is, a product that's in our smartphones and our batteries for solar energy in cars, there's an extension of the body in that way through industry, and then it's also one of the only ways to get a gold pigment in a glaze for ceramics is either through real gold or through manganese. So it's in the glazes of the ship and the 2 gargoyle-like sculptures upstairs too.
Now you bring up gold and you didn't want to work on gold.
I told you it was in there.
Okay, okay.
It's just hidden.
So we'll go to a next project also that connects, so you mentioned pigment, and I think pigment was really important in this work. It was a 3-part exhibition titled Pigs and Poison that took place across Spike Island, the Guangdong Times Museum, and Govert Brewster Gallery, sort of during COVID, so from 2020 to 2022. And the title of the exhibition refers to the way Chinese indentured laborers were referred to specifically in the US as pigs. And poison refers to opium, which was both referring to its trade and its use to kind of subdue and control these working populations. The exhibition also dealt with the way contagion was kind of racialized and projected onto Asian bodies historically, but also obviously happening during COVID. It had a very, was reflecting the present sort of very vividly. So I just wanted you to touch on this a little bit on how maybe the mural here and the use of the pigment also kind of translated to your working with manganese as well.
Yeah, also I should say that like COVID hadn't happened when I made this work. And so it was this weird cycle of history repeating itself in terms of the kind of rhetoric of race being tied to disease and contagion. So one thing I didn't mention is that one of my interests in porcelain is that it was used as a filter, a scientific filter to study bacteria, and actually the discovery of viruses comes out of the fact that porcelain could filter bacteria but not viruses, and so it led scientists to wonder what was a thing smaller than bacteria. So the birth of virology itself comes from porcelain, and also ideas around hygiene and discipline are like a big part of my work, and that was part of my interest in porcelain. And so in this case, I was looking at plague outbreaks around the turn of the 19th to 20th century and the way those were tied with immigration policies in the US, specifically around indentured Asian laborers coming in. And the wall mural in this case has an image of Chinese indentured laborers working in Louisiana on a plantation next to a sugarcane field on fire. And it's painted with bone black pigment instead of upstairs. The murals are painted with manganese black pigment. And the bone black pigment comes from, I read this 1873 Cuba Commission report where the Chinese government had heard that the laborers were being really mistreated. So they did a commission to look into it, and there was a case where a lot of them were committing suicide to escape the labor conditions. And one of them had this passage where he said, to dissuade us from suicide, our bodies are not even buried, but are desecrated and burned into bone char along with the bodies of livestock. And that bone char is used to refine sugar and make it more white. So there's this kind of way that color that we think of as beautiful color that we use in our artworks is actually charged with histories of violence and extraction, and so ties to the manganese extracted in other violent ways that's in the murals upstairs.
Yeah, no, I think maybe we move on to the next work, or if we have time, yeah.
Sure. So this is an exhibition that I think started at the Walker Art Center in Minneapolis 2 years ago, and then traveled as well. And I wanted to pay attention to the sculptural work, because it's with the gargoyles that we kind of saw a little bit of. I think they share a similar visual language. And hey, here's a cat. Many cats actually in the background. But can you tell us about the kind of visual language that you use, your use of monster-like figures, and maybe these grotesque words that is appropriate to use?
Well, I think they're beautiful. Yeah, I think it started intuitively. As a kid, I always drew like these kind of monstrous or half human, half animal figures, but I've had to think about why I continue to look at certain kinds of imagery. And a lot of it is drawn from things like the figures earlier with the multiple faces, in the back, the middle there, come from this guy, George Salamazar, who pretended to be from Formosa, present-day Taiwan, in the 1700s, and he was traveling to London, and he had a kind of audience with the bishop where he pretended to be Formosan, and it was this kind of moment that fascinated me because it's this moment where race is not based on phenotype, but is based on like cultural difference and species difference or like gender difference. And so also books like, there's probably a lot of ones that are more relevant here that I don't know about, but I was looking at books like The Book of Marvels by John Mandeville, which has like the dog-headed men from Nicosia in Asia, Nicobar, sorry. So I got interested in using this kind of imagery, both because I just personally like that imagery, but also because it's tied to ways that cultural otherness is like visually depicted kind of in these really early moments.
Also using this work, kind of animals or non-human animals have a very important place in your work, and we've talked about the installation that's above. We've talked about the manganese a lot, so the commodity, but the other central character is the sea cucumber, which is a kind of strange slug-like animal. But very seriously, you always tend to mix both, or maybe not always, but often animals have a very important presence in the stories you tell. Can you tell us more about the sea cucumber and more about how you work with animals?
I think the shift is actually around this time where there's always been like insects or plants or things, but more as objects of trade. And then in this show and in the sea cucumbers upstairs, I'm allowing the animal to take a more central and imaginative role. So the sea cucumber in the work upstairs, it's almost like this place for fiction or the speculative. So instead of it just being a heavy narrative or a didactic narrative around the extraction of manganese, I wanted to introduce a possibility. So what happens if like manganese, which is toxic, is consumed and does a kind of transformative act to the sea cucumbers where they change the way they reproduce, and their bodies, instead of reproducing heterosexually, they split their bodies actually into multiple pieces. And so what if the animal comes in almost as the way to talk about alternative worlds or alternative ways of being? And that's the same in the case of the animals, the cats in this work. There's a lot of animation and narrative. Yeah, that's a different work, but that's also a different work. But those cats also, the cats always function, but also they're a little bit humorous because they're often these like narrative moments, and they bring in their like body humor and their like their ways of talking that is different, not that different, but like a little different than humans.
Well, I think we're going to end there and give everyone time to go upstairs and see the work itself. So thank you so much, Candice.
Thank you. Thank you.
I'd like to just also end by thanking, the team that worked closely with you on the exhibition. Of course, Ansif, Barish, Zahra, who worked really closely with you on producing the work upstairs, Giacomo, Nassif, and Dina from the exhibitions team specifically, and of course Ruba, who worked with us on the Arabic text really closely, and Jenna, who supported us in organizing the event tonight. And as partners, we wanted to thank, well, not partners, but original commissioners, the Sydney Biennial team, and also the Monash University of Modern Art Museum.
Thank you
for working with
guys
us
so much.
Thank you. So everyone, please enjoy the exhibition. Thank you.